I did my biography on was Rosemary Kennedy, and the book is called Rosemary, the Hidden Kennedy Daughter. So at first when I was looking for books to read, I initially thought Rosemary Kennedy was John F. Kennedy's daughter, but as I found out, she's actually his sister. So I wanted to learn a little bit more about why she was, quote, the hidden Kennedy or the secret. So Rosemary, also known as Rosemary, was born September 13th, 1918. And there was a delay for the doctor to show up, so the nurse had to push Rosemary back into the birth canal. So some believe that this affected and led to her disabilities that she had. So her mother, Rose, noticed that she developed a little bit later than her two sons, but she just kind of blamed this on gender temperament. So looking at her family, her father was known as a womanizer, and the mother often took holidays, but she had very strict guidelines in her household that even concluded into Saturday morning weigh-ins. She was very obsessed with the children's weight and even had a little book recording all the different weights of the children. So Rosemary, her sisters started to surpass her, and in kindergarten she was labeled as deficient, and she repeated kindergarten in first grade. And her father, during her childhood, was often away in New York, so they eventually moved the whole family there in 1927. And she didn't settle very well. She had a lot of anxiety and frustration. So at age 10, she began homeschool, and she noticed that she was not treated like the others, so this kind of led to even more of a rebellion from her. And at age 11, they decided to send her to boarding school for intellectually challenged students, and she stayed there for 3 years, which is much longer than she stayed in most schools. And during this time, she had very low self-esteem and confidence, so this led to her outbursts, and her teachers kept constantly saying she was not pushing herself, and they saw that this was because of her low self-esteem. And so later on, her father became in charge of where she was going to go to school, so she developed a good relationship with her father, and even her sister. They bonded in a certain way because they both had these kind of outbursts. Obviously, Rosemary's was much more severe than her sister's. So during adolescence, Rosemary moved schools 5 different times. In many of the schools, she was not asked to return. At age 15, they said her handwriting was similar to a 10-year-old. And at one of her schools, she received injections because her family just wanted to, quote, cure her. Somebody who worked side by side with her described her as socially awkward. She had a lot of anxiety, didn't like being out in public, and she was very clumsy. So her father got a job at being an ambassador, and so they moved the whole family to London. So this really focused on her father being in the spotlight. So her mother took over Rosemary's education plan, which really caused a strain in their relationship. And because the family was always in the spotlight, they really tried to push Rosemary, send her away so nobody would find about her disabilities. And she started to resent her family and be very jealous of her sister, in particular Kit, because she lived a freer lifestyle than her, even though she was younger than her. So there was one school when she was in London that she really thrived at, and this was a school that had adapted the Montessori education. So she really started to please her parents. She stayed thin, she became a child of Mary, and she was really away from her family, so there wasn't as much pressure to be, the quote, perfect Kennedy child. But she still had her occasional lashing out. But unfortunately, the war broke out, and she had to be sent home to America. And this was a really downfall for her in her life because she became very depressed. She saw that the siblings that were closest to her in age, they were really growing up without her. And she more related to her siblings that were very much younger than her. And she really began to lash out, hit people, wander away, run away. So she moved to 3 more different schools, and her family saw that these schools were really just not working out. So her mother and father didn't know what to do. They were very scared that people would find out. So her father looked into this experimental brain surgery, and he even had her sister Kit look into it, and Kit sidekick said, "This really isn't a good idea. Don't think you should do it." But he went away with the surgery anyway. In November 1941, she had a lobotomy. And this really messed her up. The surgery did not go as planned, and she had limitations to walk and talk. She could only say a few words. So her dad put her in this place called the Craig House, and that's where she stayed the remaining of her life. And at this time, though, even though she had this surgery that really did a toll on her, this actually turned into a positive time for Rosemary because she was surrounded by nuns who really understood her differences and learned to cope to the needs of what Rosemary needed, unlike what her family did not do her entire life. And her mother did not visit her until about 20 years later. And she became very close with her sister. And her sister and her brother, John F. Kennedy, really pushed for laws and programs to be started for the mental and physical disabilities of people. And she eventually died in January 7th, 2005 at 86 years old. So if we look at the analyzing Rosemary Kennedy's life according to the developmental theorists, we first think about Freud. So in Freud, the essence of development was the emergence of the id, the ego, and the superego. So throughout each stage, it's kind of forming these three parts of the brain, so say. So in the oral and anal stage, this is really time for bonding with the father and the mother. And as explained earlier, Rosemary's father was away often for work, and even her mother left for a period of time when she had just turned 1, so that kind of stopped a little bit of their bonding together, and even explained throughout Rosemary's life, the mother had a very strict guideline about their household. So since Rosemary had her disability, she could never reach those strict guidelines, so that led to a lot of anxiety in her life. So in the phallic stage, it's kind of the ego, because there is this formation of the ego, a lot of the anxiety is reduced. But since Rosemary had so much anxiety, this meant that the ego was not forming as much as it should have been. So in period of latency, so this is a time that they forget sexual urges and focus on acquiring cognitive skills and assimilating cultural values. So Rosemary knew that she was very different from the other children, and as well as from her siblings, and so this led a lot to her social awkwardness and isolation from everybody. And because she had her learning disability, she was very far behind than all the other children, and she was kind of labeled as deficient. So therefore her ego and her superego did not develop regularly, so this led to her outbursts and a lot of her anxiety. So Erickson had a very much emphasis on identity, understanding, and acceptance of both the self and one's identity. Rosemary didn't really have much of an identity for herself because nobody really accepted her in her world, and a lot of her motivations were motivations from her family and not really her. So if we look at some of the crises in each stage, basic trust versus basic mistrust, she gained trust later with her father, and she didn't really have a very good relationship with her mother, probably because her mother was away for a majority of time and couldn't really deal with her Rosemary's disability. In autonomy versus shame and doubt, she really had to depend on other people. So this led to her self-esteem issues. At this time, they usually develop independence, but she couldn't really do that because she wasn't able to do many things on her own. In industry versus inferiority, she struggled in school, and she moved schools several schools different time. So this once again led to her failure in school. In intimacy versus isolation, many people described her as beautiful, but her parents really kept everyone away from her. They wanted to keep her disability secret, and they didn't want boys to take advantage of her disability because Rosemary really liked attention to her, but her parents kind of saw that as her weak spot. So in Vygotsky, he had a real big focus on the environment and the child and how they all affected one another. So if we look at the child in activity in cultural context, so if we look at Rosemary's Society, they did not like children who were, quote, different. That's why the family put a lot of pressure on themselves as well as Rosemary to hide her disability because they didn't want people to know that she was different, because a lot of people who had disabilities were sent off to places, institutions, and they did not want that for their child. They wanted their child to be, quote, pure. And not many schools were adapted in order to help Rosemary. They did have certain schools who were called, to help the individuals with disabilities, but Rosemary, because there was such high expectations for her, she was just in such a low point in her life that she just couldn't push herself very much in order to achieve the standards that society and her family had for her. So if we also look at the zone of proximal development, the skills needed for Rosemary in her culture were just so high for her that she could never reach them. So this led to her frustration and anxiety, as we talked about before. And there was one part, it says, the goal, values, and motivation are inseparable for cognitive activity. So Rosemary didn't really have, the main drive for her was to please her parents. She just wanted to be like her sisters because she saw how much freedom that they had, and she just really wanted to make her parents happy. So she wasn't really doing it a lot for herself. She didn't really have a lot of motivation. Her motivation was mostly from her parents, and there was just such a high expectation for her that she could not get through that barrier in her mind. So it says the ideal endpoint depends on the goals of her particular culture. So Rosemary really did not thrive until later in her life after she had her lobotomy, because she was in the Craig house and she was surrounded by the nuns who accepted her. She was no longer around her family and her mother, who was always constantly criticizing her. She was surrounded by more people who were okay with her disabilities and focused on what she could do rather than what she could not do.